In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Treasurer. Were jobs lost in every single state and territory in the first full fortnight after he cut JobKeeper?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I can confirm that 446,000 jobs have been created over the last 4 months, Mr Speaker, and the unemployment rate today is 6.9%. And what we have done is we have put in place $507 billion of economic support.
The Treasurer will resume his seats. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Point of order, Mr Speaker, on direct relevance. It is hard to think of a more specific question. And while I appreciate rulings that they don't have to give a yes or no.
Members on my right. The Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
While I appreciate that a question can't demand a yes or no, to simply riff off anything relating to jobs is a long way from the specific way this question was asked.
Yes, I say to the Manager of Opposition Business, he makes a reasonable point. I was allowing the Treasurer a preamble, but this is a very, very specific question, and Manager of Opposition Business is right. It might invite a yes or no, but it can't demand a yes or no answer. But the Treasurer needs to be directly relevant to the question that's in the standing orders, or wind up his answer.
Mr Speaker, I can confirm that the unemployment ticked up to 6.9%, and that it is expected by Treasury and indeed the Reserve Bank to actually increase unemployment between now and the end of the year, up to around 8%, but by mid-next year, 7.25%. Now, Mr Speaker, the member for Rankin did refer to JobKeeper, and what was implicit in his question was the tapering, and actually explicit in his question was the tapering of JobKeeper. And I need to remind the House in that context that the tapering of JobKeeper has been supported and advocated by the Leader of the Opposition and by the honourable member for Rankin, Mr Speaker. And I repeat, as he said on ABC The Business, he was asked about how long the tapering should be, and he said, and I quote, "They should be looking at a kind of tapering, Mr Speaker." And I refer to the Leader of the Opposition when he was asked about would you extend JobKeeper and extend those increases.
The Treasurer is now moving way beyond what was a very specific question.
Mr Speaker, the question was put about the tapering of JobKeeper and the impact on jobs. And the message to those opposite is that we have seen the creation of jobs, but we've also seen a tapering in JobKeeper, which is something that those opposite have advocated for.
The member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is demonstrating strong national and international leadership in addressing the challenges we face as a nation, including regional and economic security and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and recession?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Wentworth for his question and the considerable experience he brings to this chamber on the matters that he's raised here in his question today, Mr Speaker. And he would understand that this year we have rightly been focused on the extraordinary challenges here in Australia, the domestic challenges in dealing, though, with what is a global COVID-19 pandemic and a global COVID-19 recession that has followed from that pandemic. And while that is true, Mr Speaker, it has been Australia's performance during this time that has not just gone not unnoticed here by Australians, but in fact, Mr Speaker, so many nations around the world, because Australia now forms a small group of nations that have been able to perform best, Mr Speaker, amongst the nations of the world in terms of how we have dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic and the COVID-19 recession. Indeed, you could say we are part of a small group of leading nations, Mr Speaker, when it comes to our government's handling and working with other governments around the country and the Australian people in managing this pandemic. And, Mr Speaker, this has not gone unnoticed by those overseas. And earlier today I had the great honour to speak to President-elect Biden, Mr Speaker. And it was a very warm conversation, Mr Speaker, and I welcome and congratulate him on his election. But, Mr Speaker, one of the key issues that President-elect Biden raised in the call was the seeking of input from Australia in how we have been so successful as a nation in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and the COVID-19 recession. And I welcome, Mr Speaker, his great commitment as President-elect to this region and to the important alliance. An alliance, Mr Speaker, that spans generations and will continue to serve the security needs and the prosperity and peace needs of this country in the region and more broadly. But, Mr Speaker, we're also able to discuss the fact that next week I'll be joining the new Prime Minister of Japan, Prime Minister Suga, in Tokyo to further strengthen our relationship on both security and economic issues. That will be followed on my return at Port Moresby with Prime Minister Marape, where the issues in the South West Pacific remain so incredibly important to our own future, and supporting our Pacific family in the COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular our support for them through the comprehensive vaccine strategy which has been developed by the Minister for Health and will also be discussed at the National Cabinet meeting tomorrow. Mr Speaker, this weekend the ASEAN Forum will convene and we will join the East Asia Summit, and we will be speaking to the issues of the COVID-19 pandemic there and the leadership role Australia has been able to play, but also the support we're also providing to ASEAN nations, not just in terms of the pandemic, but issues more broadly.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that last night the government did a deal with One Nation to allow workers to be sacked or have their hours cut for cheaper workers with a hiring credit?
The Prime Minister.
Then we'll go for that. Mr Speaker, what I can confirm last night is the government implemented its plan to get Australians back into the work, Mr Speaker, as part of a comprehensive set of measures that were outlined by the Treasurer in this year's budget. A COVID-19 recession recovery plan set out in our budget, building on the record investments that we have made as a government on behalf of the Australian people to ensure that this nation stands amongst a group of nations, small in number, that have been able to address not just the health impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, but the severe blow of the COVID-19 recession that follows, Mr Speaker, and that has been through the unprecedented investment in measures, whether it be JobKeeper or JobSeeker, the Job Trainer Fund, Mr Speaker, the cash flow boost, and the Job Maker hiring credit to get Australians back into work. Now, Mr Speaker, we will remain committed to putting these measures in place. We have the protections in place to ensure, Mr Speaker, the integrity of these measures support Australians right across the community. And, Mr Speaker, we'll get on with that job, despite the opposition we get from those opposite, despite the undermining we get from those opposite, pretending it's some sort of bipartisanship in a pandemic when on every occasion, Mr Speaker, they take the opportunity to undermine, Mr Speaker, and seek to circumvent the record level of support that our government is putting in place. Mr Speaker, Australians know that this government has their back, and they know that Labor has turned their back on them.
The member for Nichols.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government is demonstrating strong leadership in our economic recovery from COVID-19 recession through its continued investment in critical infrastructure?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker. And strong leadership and rural and regional areas go hand in hand through the COVID recovery, because rural Australia, country Australians, are leading the way out of this terrible, terrible time, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Nichols. He's a very staunch advocate for regional development, and he knows that through the Local Roads and Community Infrastructure program that the local government areas within Nichols will benefit to the tune of $21 million. And that goes for the case for all electorates right across the nation. That particular program is going to benefit local roads and community infrastructure, and it's going to get on with the job of putting workers back on site getting tractors busy, getting excavators, pushing dirt around, and most importantly, helping the small support businesses in and around those work sites. And the member knows also the benefits which are being realised by our transformational Inland Rail project. And Inland Rail is going to go through part of his electorate in Seymour, and this corridor of commerce, expanding 1,700 kilometres, Brisbane to Melbourne. It's going to make sure that produce gets to port within 24 hours. And the first section, Parks to Narromine, completed recently, $110 million of value of goods, of services, went to 99 local and regional businesses. And I know the member for Hasluck, the minister, and certainly also the member for Barton, and maybe even the member for Lingiari will be interested to know that during this special NAIDOC week that $14.1 million was spent on that section, first section of 13, with Indigenous-owned businesses, and 298 Indigenous workers were employed on this section, and that's something that we are very proud of. We know that Inland Rail is using Liberty Steel, South Australian steel, Whyalla steel, and that's also certainly helping with the recovery out of COVID-19. Moree Mayor Katrina Humphries has applauded the contract that's been awarded for the next section of Inland Rail and Narrabri to North Star. She says, with most of Transform's rail workforce to be accommodated here in Moree, there is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for many different businesses to cater for our influx of Inland Rail personnel, as well as keeping our tourists happy too. And Inland Rail is going to have such benefits for Queensland. In fact, most of the benefits of Inland Rail will be felt, will be experienced during the construction phase and certainly beyond by Queenslanders. And Garth Hamilton, a local engineer from Toowoomba, and hopefully the next member for Groom, he says Inland Rail will deliver faster and cheaper freight for farmers whilst making Toowoomba a freight and logistics hub, bringing significant economic benefits to the region. So all are going to benefit from it. Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, very pleased that I was able to sign those intergovernmental agreements. That's delivery, that's outcomes, that's getting on with the job, and that's making sure we get the projects we need.
Concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I ask, will the Prime Minister guarantee that no worker will be sacked or have their hours cut for cheaper workers with a hiring credit?
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the protections were set out there, and the protections that sit underneath the bill. And Mr Speaker, that's why they're in place, to achieve the outcomes that the Leader of the Opposition has set out, Mr Speaker. And I will ask the Minister for Industrial Relations to add further the answer.
The Minister for Industrial Relations. Members on my left.
So, well, it is a very important question, and what this chamber and the dispatch box should not be used for is to send the wrong message to any employer or business that they might be able to do something which at law they clearly should not be doing. And the general protection provisions in the Fair Work Act, which include all casuals, include general protections against adverse action, such as dismissal, such as a reduction in their hours on the basis of a protected attribute, such as age. And an employer who contravened the general protections could face significant civil penalties of up to $13,320 for an individual and $66,000 for a body corporate, and they might also be required to pay compensation. Why would Labor be using this dispatch box to suggest to employers that they could do something that they clearly cannot and should not do, and for which there are very serious penalties if they ever were to do it?
Members on both sides. I guarantee I'll start ejecting people in a second. The member for Kennedy.
Minister representing Trade, doesn't China's trade sanctions and threats make a mockery of free trade agreements? And will your government now adopt self-reliance and recreation of industry as policy imperatives? All cars purchased under a government contract, Australian-made, 22% ethanol mandate as exists in Brazil, laws dictating water supply and sewage pumps be made in Australia. Minister, doesn't the free markets Belt and Road reinstate the convict colony?
The Minister representing the Minister for Trade.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. It's an incredibly important question. As he would know, the Australian government has chosen not to enter into a written agreement on the BRI, and one thing that he can be absolutely certain of is that we will pursue our national interests, and we will pursue our national interests strongly. Now, there have been reports about China placing restrictions on our exports, and we find these deeply troubling. As a matter of fact, there was another report today. Of logs being part of these restrictions, and that's going to impact the Port of Portland and parts of my electorate.
Minister will just resume his seat for a second. Hang on. I'll come to you. I've got to give you the call, okay? Otherwise, you've just we can't hear. Hang on. You're on mute. Then, do you want to make a point of order or not? Righto. Okay, that's over. Minister, got the call.
So, Mr Speaker, I could hear what the member was saying. He was actually wanting to be able to hear the answer because he sees this as something that's incredibly important, and he wasn't able to hear it. So he was actually asking for the interjections on the other side.
I'll just say to the minister, if he'd actually let me give him the call, he could have said that. So, but do you want to swap seats, or what do you want to do?
No, I was just trying to point out.
Okay, well, get on with your answer.
Yeah, I was just trying to point out what he was trying to say, Mr Speaker. So, I don't know whether you can now hear me, Member for Kennedy, but thank you for your question. And the Australian government has chosen not to enter into a written agreement on the BRI, and we will pursue our national interests incredibly strongly and stand up for it at all times. Now, there have been reports that we've heard about China placing restrictions on our exports, and these are deeply troubling. As a matter of fact, today there were more reports about logs out of the Port of Portland having restrictions placed on them, and I know that this is something that the member for Barker and myself in particular are concerned about. But Chinese authorities have denied these rumours, and we welcome these statements. And given these denials, we would expect Chinese authorities to work as effectively as possible to resolve trade issues in a timely way. We recognise that there are a range of factors behind each trade issue. In the main, China has been at pains to talk about the technical aspects China has alleged non-compliance with various technical import requirements. Now, one of the benefits of CHAFTA, the free trade agreement that we have with China, is that it gives us the parameters to work through these disputes, and that's what we will be seeking to do with China. Now, when it comes to import replacements such as ethanol, government policies, Australian government policies, allow for ethanol in fuel. And as the member would be aware, Queensland and New South Wales actually have E10 standards, and we would encourage other states and territories to adopt similar approaches. Thank you.
The member for Curtin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how the Morrison government's strong and decisive economic leadership is helping families, generating jobs and rebuilding our economy during this COVID-19 recession? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Curtin and acknowledge her experience as the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Notre Dame, Mr Speaker, and as a Professor of Law and as someone who is specialised in insolvency and is very pleased with the insolvency reforms that we have introduced into the parliament today, Mr Speaker. And the member for Curtin, like other members on this side of the House, understand that last night, when the JobMaker hiring credit passed the parliament, that it will help support 450,000 jobs, Mr Speaker. 450,000 jobs will be supported by the JobMaker hiring credit, and it was a big win. It was a big win for the job prospects of thousands of Australians who are looking to move from unemployment into work, Mr Speaker. And we as a government will provide up to $200 a week to employers who take on an eligible employee for a minimum of 20 hours a week, where that employee is aged between 16 and 35, Mr Speaker. And Treasury have said that this will support around 450,000 jobs. And this legislation got through the parliament despite the games of those opposite. The games of those opposite, where they were looking for any hill to fight on to distract from the divisions between the member for Hindmarsh, Mr Speaker, and the member for Hunter, Mr Speaker. Aided, of course, by his legal adviser, the member for Isaacs, Mr Speaker. But the big winner of that division was the member for Chifley, Mr Speaker, who is now the Shadow Minister for Agriculture and Resources, despite his electorate not seeing a sheep station since Federation, Mr Speaker. Now, the reality is that the JobMaker hiring credit, together with the tax cuts that we have passed through the parliament, Mr Speaker, and the infrastructure spending and the expanded instant asset write-off and the loss carryback will help create nearly 1 million new jobs, Mr Speaker. And we're already seeing the Australian economic recovery underway. Consumer sentiment is up, business sentiment is up, consumer confidence up 10 weeks in a row, Mr Speaker. Our AAA credit rating reaffirmed, the Governor of the Reserve Bank saying that our economic response is the right response, Mr Speaker, and 446,000 jobs created in the last 4 months. On this side of the House, we support jobs, jobs and more jobs.
The member for Lawler.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister guarantee workers over 35 looking for a job that they won't be turned away in favour of a young worker with a hiring credit?
The Treasurer.
Well, Mr Speaker, the many measures in this budget are designed to create jobs right across the economy for people of all ages. And the tax cuts that have been legislated for 11.5 million Australians, the two $250 payments that are coming to pensioners and carers and others on income support, the expansion of the instant asset write-off to businesses with a turnover up to $5 billion, the loss carryback measure, the measure that is designed to support new skilling and training, like through the Job Trainer program, which is open to people of all ages. That is designed to create economic activity. But, Mr Speaker, the question was going to the heart of what passed the parliament last night, which was the JobMaker hiring credit. And as I've told the House before, we have focused on getting younger people into work because they have been heavily hit. And today, Mr Speaker, the unemployment rate for those aged 15 to 34 is 10.2%. But those who are aged 35 to 44, the unemployment rate is 4.7%. And in terms of people aged 15 to 34, from March to September, there has been a 6.1% decrease in the number of jobs, or 307,000 people. In contrast, over the same time, the decline in jobs for those aged 35 and over has been 1.4%, or 109,000 people. Mr Speaker, so the reality is that people of all ages have lost jobs and businesses have closed, some to not reopen. But we, the Morrison government, are doing everything we can to help get people into a job regardless of their age.
And I call the member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister outline how the Morrison government's leadership in securing a COVID-19 vaccine has assisted in keeping Australian lives and livelihoods safe during the coronavirus pandemic?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Reid, a practising psychologist for almost 20 years, a deep focus on mental health, and somebody who has witnessed the challenges that Australians have faced, not just with their health, but with their mental health during the year of COVID-19. Today, an important step forward, not just with regards to health, but also mental health. A fourth day out of 5 of 0 cases of community transmission nationwide. An immensely important step on the road to having Australia back to being not just COVID normal, but normal. At the same time, we see abroad another 24 hours with over 600,000 cases, and agonisingly, the
worst day ever for loss of life from COVID-19. Over 10,000 cases, 10,000 lives lost for the first time. So against that background, we recognise that no matter what we do with containment in Australia, ultimately a vaccine must be required, not just for Australia but for around the world. And so the work that we have done as a nation is helping to lead in Australia but helping to lead internationally with regards to the development and distribution and acquisition of vaccines. With regard to the development, what we've been able to do is invest $363 million in research relating to COVID-19. In particular, our vaccine research has seen vaccines underway through investments in Adelaide, in Melbourne, in Sydney and in particular the University of Queensland in Brisbane. The University of Queensland Molecular Clamp has a $5 million investment from the Australian government. The progress so far of the results has been good and we await with anticipation further results in the coming weeks. But the news is positive and good, and Australia is playing a role not just at home but internationally with that leadership. In addition to that, I'm pleased to be able to inform the House that we have secured cold chain logistics distribution capacity for the Pfizer vaccine, one of the 4 vaccines which Australia has been able to acquire as part of a 134.8 million unit purchasing program, with an additional 25.5 million units available under the COVAX facility, enough to protect all Australians 3 times over. But this cold chain logistics is innovative. It's about making sure that we can provide the mRNA vaccine if that is the successful vaccine. Our hope and our expectation is that it won't just be one, though, that all of those 4, and hopefully some of those other vaccines in which we're investing, will be successful. And through that, we'll be saving lives and protecting lives in Australia, but also helping to save lives and protect lives around the world.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations. Yesterday in this House, the Minister said that job ads that state a preference for workers who are under 35 and eligible for the hiring credit should not exist under the Fair Work Act. I have here 16 jobs advertised online, all of which prefer or require applicants to be eligible for the hiring credit. What action has the Minister taken since Labor raised this issue yesterday?
Members on both sides. The Attorney-General.
Well, Mr Speaker, the question yesterday was with respect to someone in Diamond Creek who was a single mother in her 40s who said that she'd never been unemployed until now. She found a job ad which stated that candidates under 30 were preferred, so the employer could receive the hiring credit. Now, it would not be an exception, and you could not advertise for people preferred over existing employees if that person—
Members on my left.
Well, you could not. There are existing exemptions to the Age Discrimination Act, but you cannot advertise saying that you prefer someone in a way in which would displace an existing person who on their age was not inside the hiring credit. Now, that would be quite wrong. There are exemptions to the discrimination legislation, which have long been there, which do allow and do permit prospective employees to target employees who fit within a Commonwealth employment program. So that is an exemption, but you cannot advertise for someone to receive the hiring credit in a way that would displace an existing employee. You cannot do that.
The members on my left, the Manager of Opposition Business seeking to table a series of documents.
Yeah, I've got 16. Can I go through them one at a time?
No, no. I think you can do it
I'd
as a
seek
job.
leave to table the 16 job advertisements.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted. The member for Braddon. Member for Braddon has the call. We'll start again. I don't think your microphone was on.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is leading domestic and international efforts to protect and preserve our environment?
The Minister for the Environment.
Mr Speaker, it's a pleasure to take a question from my friend, the member for Braddon in the great state of Tasmania and to talk about the Australian government's strong domestic and international leadership on protecting the environment, whether it be oceans, reefs, climate adaptation in our unique natural landscapes. Australia is indeed a global leader. And there's no place where this is more demonstrated than in Antarctica, which is of special interest to every single Tasmanian. Australia has always been the strongest voice in protecting this last untouched wilderness on Earth. And at a recent international meeting, once again our efforts to champion a new East Antarctic marine park. While we haven't got there yet, we were joined by Norway and Uruguay as new co-sponsors. Our efforts in Antarctica will always have a focus on scientific research, protecting the environment and using the continent for peaceful purposes. We've reported about the construction and operation of a new icebreaker which is undergoing sea trials near the Netherlands, advancing the Davis Aerodrome project, the first all-weather runway, and of most interest, the million-year ice core drill, which is being made in Hobart with the amazing Australian Antarctic Division. This is an ice core drill that will drill to find how the climate on Earth changed a million years ago. There is no doubt that our Antarctic scientists punch well above their weight. With their deep understanding of southern ocean climate systems, I find it amazing that the opposition is laughing at the work of Antarctic science. I think it's extraordinary. Mr Speaker, the Great Barrier Reef, now benchmarked against global standards, our management of the reef is recognised as a leading example, and it's considered by many to the gold standard. But you know, that's not me saying that, that's UNESCO saying that. It's in their reports. Because of the work we're doing in our pioneering reef research and adaptation program, funded through our $1.9 billion investment on the reef. Such work as enhancing the natural genetic adaptation of corals so they can survive in warming waters. The Minister for Science is well aware of the program at the Australian Institute of Marine Science. Back on land, I know the member for Braddon is interested in land care, a movement which does attract international acclaim because it brings together conservation and the production of food and fibre on the 50% of our continent that is managed by farmers. And the Minister for Agriculture would agree that enhances our international clean, green reputation. Mr Speaker, I could talk about our Indigenous protected areas. 74 million hectares is managed with the unique approach of our first Australians, and that extraordinary work, again, is internationally acclaimed. So there's no better way to demonstrate leadership than what we do on the ground, with practical action in communities, oceans, reefs, sea ranges, land care.
Concluded. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations. Can the Minister confirm that there is no protection against employers excluding workers over the age of 35 from even being allowed to apply for a job?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
Well, with respect, the question doesn't make any sense. I mean, there is a provision in the Age Discrimination Act which allows for the existence of Commonwealth programs that target people by a cohort of disadvantage, including age. What has Labor got against a policy designed to help the people most in need with the highest rates of unemployment, which are young Australians? What has Labor got against that policy? What is the problem that they have? As the Treasurer noted, it is young Australians who have suffered most in terms of unemployment during the COVID recession. It's young Australians who are going to have the longest scarring effect to their employment and their wage earning capacity, and there is enormous effort by this government through the hiring credit and other matters to try and bring those young Australians back into employment as quickly as possible. And precisely those types of provisions in the Age Discrimination Act, which have been there since 2004, allow for Commonwealth programs of precisely this type. There have been many Commonwealth programs that have specifically tried to target the people at the greatest disadvantage, which right here and now are young Australians. So the point is that is precisely what we are doing, is trying to help those people who have the greatest disadvantage. But I will say now, as I have said again, as a message to the House, as a message to employers, notwithstanding that we are trying to help those people
who are suffering the greatest disadvantage in terms of unemployment. You cannot, under the Fair Work Act, favour those people against existing employees by adverse action against those existing employees. In addition to which, there are a whole range of protections that the Treasurer has clearly outlined that means that you cannot do what it is that the opposition are suggesting quite falsely to people who listen to this and take cues from it that they can do. They can't. It is designed to help young people, not disadvantage anyone else.
The member for COWPER.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on how—
Can the member stop for a second? Can those members interjecting cease interjecting? I mean, he's trying to ask a question. If you want to have a loud conversation, go and do it outside the chamber. Can the member for COWPER start his question again?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison-McCormack's government leadership on protecting children from online threats includes working with international agencies to prevent abuse and prosecute perpetrators?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. I recognise his service with the New South Wales Police Force and work as a detective on many crime types, but including child protection. Went on to become a police prosecutor, went on to become, after his policing career, a lawyer, so he went off the rails at that point. But nonetheless, Mr Speaker, a very distinguished career before he came into this place. Mr Speaker, Mensa, you didn't get that. That wasn't for you. Mr Speaker, the fact is that we have, as I've mentioned in this place on a number of occasions, made a priority for this government to protect children, and we've worked with our international partners to make sure that we can protect children, in particular online. I want to praise the work of the Australian Federal Police in Operation Arkstone that many Australians would have read about in the papers over the course of the last couple of days. 14 men have been arrested on 828 charges of child exploitation. The Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation, based in Brisbane, along with the Australian Federal Police in New South Wales, Queensland Police Services as well as WA Police, worked with US Homeland Security to identify these vile individuals and to stop them from causing further harm. The operation has now identified 46 Australian victims of child sexual abuse, including 16 from a childcare centre. Homeland Security partnered with the Australian Federal Police during search warrant activity, and that intelligence has led to the outcomes that we've seen. I want to thank very much the United States government and the United Kingdom government as well for the work that they've done with us on making this area of investigation an area of priority for us. It is the reality, Mr Speaker, that our children are being targeted not just by offenders who would be Australian-based but offenders offshore, and similarly Australian-based men seeking to target children in other parts of the world, including Southeast Asia. And our work with the Biden administration will continue because it is such an important area of mutual assistance that we provide to each other. And the work that Homeland Security does with my Department of Home Affairs really is world-leading. And the centre in Brisbane has given us international credibility to work with partners in our own region, to work with partners across Europe, and we have many people who are located in the Brisbane office who are working with NGOs, including people, for example, like Bruce and Denise Morecambe, so that we can leverage off those relationships to protect more children. We know that there's been a massive spike during COVID of online activity and the targeting and grooming of those children, and the fact, Mr Speaker, that we've been able to save these children from further violation is something of which our country should be very proud.
And the Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Labor joins with the government in thanking our authorities as well as the authorities in the United Kingdom and the United States for this absolutely critical work to keep children safe. This abhorrent practice, which is hard to understand why it exists, exists far too much. And the fact that there's been a rise is, as the Minister has said during COVID, has had devastating effects. I think this would be a really tough area to work in. and we need to look after our people in those authorities who undertake that work because of mental health issues and others that would occur, because I can't imagine working in that area. But I thank the Minister for his answer.
The member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Marco from Hobartville is 53 and a qualified fitter whose work dried up about a month ago. He says he's been a victim of the government's illegal robo-debt scheme. Marco is cut out of the hiring credit scheme and he isn't eligible for mature worker subsidies yet. How is Marco meant to get ahead when government policy is making it harder for him to get a job?
The Treasurer.
Well, Mr Speaker, as the honourable member knows, the Morrison government has announced a record $507 billion of support, both balance sheet support and direct fiscal support, designed to create jobs across the country for members and constituents in that electorate, Mr Speaker, whatever their age. Now, the JobMaker hiring credit is focused on those aged 16 to 35, because, as I said to the House prior, that the unemployment rate for those who are aged 15 to 34 is 10.2%. But for those who are aged 35 to 44, the unemployment rate is 4.7%. And we look back at Australia's experience with previous recessions, and particularly the 1990s recession, where it took a full decade to get the unemployment rate back below 6% from where it started. But for younger people, it took a full 15 years to get the unemployment rate back below the levels from which they started prior to the recession. So, Mr Speaker, we will continue to implement and to legislate the announcements that we made in the budget. Announcements such as the tax cuts, announcements such as the expanded instant asset write-off, the research and development incentives, the loss carryback measures, all already legislated, and the JobMaker hiring credit from last night. They're all about doing one thing, which is creating jobs across the honourable member's electorate and indeed the electorates represented by all those in this House.
The member for Moncrieff.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reductions. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government's strong and decisive leadership in the area of energy technology is lowering energy costs and reducing Australia's emissions? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Moncrieff for her question. And as a small business person before she came into this place, she knows the importance of technology-led approaches to bringing down emissions, Mr Speaker. Technology, not taxes. Now, Australia's experience has been that when new technologies become competitive with higher-emitting alternatives, small businesses and households take them up. They take them up, Mr Speaker, and we're seeing that with renewables, where we're seeing investment in renewables in this country 10 times the global average, Mr Speaker, and 4 times places like the United States and Europe, Mr Speaker. And our ambition is to be a global leader in low and zero emissions technologies, Mr Speaker. That's our ambition. Now, that's the focus of our technology investment roadmap. That's exactly what we're doing. We're building from our position as a world-leading exporter in energy products into these lower technology areas, Mr Speaker. Now, technologies like hydrogen, soil carbon and carbon capture and storage, all technologies, Mr Speaker, that President-elect Biden is supporting, Mr Speaker. And we know, as the US knows, that widespread deployment of these technologies, our priority technologies, will substantially reduce emissions or eliminate them in sectors responsible for 90% of the world's emissions, Mr Speaker. But it will take international collaboration and leadership to achieve this, Mr Speaker. Now, speaking of leadership, this week, the member for Hunter has shown some leadership. He's taken the battle for blue-collar workers to the backbench, Mr Speaker, but not before an almighty dust-up on the front bench, Mr Speaker, like something out of the gunfight
the Minister
at the
resume
OK
his seat for
Corral.
a second. The Minister for Agriculture. just say to the Minister for Energy, he needs to relate his remarks to the question. The member for Barton needs to let me finish. He was asked about alternative approaches. The minister has an alternative approach isn't a political commentary on what's happened. The question asked about the government's policy and an alternative approach, and I just have to say, second deputy speaker is not helping. Just have to say to the minister that he doesn't need to confine himself to that. Asking for an alternative approach. He's not asking to give a political commentary on what may or may not have happened inside party rooms or party forums. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, I'll avoid political commentary, and I'll quote directly from 2GB this morning, where the member behind me said it got a bit willy.
No, the minister will resume his seat. No. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has now had over a month to adopt Labor's cheaper childcare policy that we announced on the 8th of October. Why is the Prime Minister sticking with his broken childcare system, which holds parents back from taking on a fourth or a fifth day of work in the middle of a recession?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for his question, and the minister may wish to add to this. Mr. Speaker, the policy that the government put in place, which addressed the many difficulties that the policy previously was finding, and as was highlighted by the Productivity Commission that was did its report on this topic, and we subsequently adopted, meant that the employment participation rate amongst women in this country increased to record levels. The gender pay gap fell to record lows, Mr. Speaker. The out-of-pocket expenses for childcare, Mr. Speaker, actually fell by 3.2%. Now, Mr. Speaker, we continue to support the policy that is sustainable, and it has been getting those results, Mr. Speaker. But the member makes reference to his own policy. Now, I'd happily stand corrected, Mr. Speaker, but it has been a month, and I'm still not aware of any of the detailed costing that related to the policy that the member referred to from the opposite, Mr. Speaker, of the Parliamentary Budget Office, and the detailed assumptions that sat behind that. Mr. Speaker, that is not on their website. It's not there, Mr. Speaker. It hasn't been released. The detailed assumptions of the Office of the Budget Office, the Parliamentary Budget Office, Mr.
Members
Speaker,
on my left.
They can protest that it exists, but it simply doesn't. It simply doesn't, Mr. Speaker. It simply doesn't. So, Mr. Speaker, if they are going to come up with a policy, they need to be transparent about what it costs, Mr. Speaker, and the assumptions that sit beneath that. But, Mr. Speaker, the Australian people know that when it comes to matters of policy and how you pay for it, they elected a government that knows how to do that, and they rejected an opposition who doesn't.
The member for Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the Minister please advise the House how the Morrison government continues to show strong leadership in the development of science and research to help drive our economic recovery out of the COVID-19 recession?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. The minister has the call.
Well, thank you, and I thank the member for his question. And we've both visited the CSIRO's Queensland Centre for Advanced Technologies in Pullen Vale in his electorate. They do world-leading work there, and particularly with their specialist Data 61 unit there. Now, as I said earlier this week, the challenges that we have faced this year have made Australians aware of the critical role of science, research and technology and the roles that they play in our everyday lives. And of course this is more important than ever before, because we know that the solutions that can be found through science are going to lead us out of this COVID recession. Now, central to that effort will be the role of the Chief Scientist, and earlier this week the Prime Minister announced that the new Chief Scientist will be Dr Cathy Foley. Now, she will commence her work next year, but she has been employed by the CSIRO for some 36 years in a wide range of roles. Prior to being the Chief Scientist for CSIRO, she worked in their manufacturing sector. Now, of course, under our manufacturing strategy, we're creating an even bigger role for CSIRO so that we can make sure that CSIRO is playing an integral part in developing manufacturing strategies in terms of supporting our businesses, making sure that we are harnessing science and technology to support our industries, and particularly to make sure that our manufacturing businesses can develop the scale, the resilience and the competitiveness that they need. Now, Mr Speaker, last month in the budget we provided an extra $460 million to CSIRO to address the impacts of COVID-19 and the effect that that had on the great work that they do. So that injection of funding is going to take our investment in CSIRO to $3.8 billion over the next 4 years, which is a significant investment. Now, Mr Speaker, CSIRO does amazing work across a large range of areas, but I did want to mention specifically the work that is being done by their data scientists and engineers in Data 61. They have done an amazing amount of work to support the work that's needed as part of COVID-19 to make sure that we have a good understanding of how viruses behave, how we can put in place some COVID-safe workplaces. Now, this is exactly how we're going to harness technology for the future to help us come through the recession that has been happening as a result of COVID, to prepare ourselves for the future, and science and technology will be the key enablers for industry.
The member for Kingston.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Imogen from Sandringham, in the member of Goldstein's electorate, is a part-time management consultant with 2 children, and her family is not eligible for the childcare rebate. Imogen loves her job and wants to work full-time, but says it would cost her family $6,000 a month to put her kids in childcare 5 days a week, which makes little sense. Why is this, Prime Minister, holding Australian women back from working the 4th or 5th day in a week?
The Minister for Education.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for a question. And can I remind the member that the government is providing record funding to the childcare sector, $9.2 billion this year, and that will grow to $10 billion in the coming years. And can I once again, and I'm sure I say this on behalf of all members of the House, thank all those people who work in the early childhood and care sector for the extraordinary job that they've done, in providing care throughout this pandemic. As a matter of fact, by working with the government, the sector has been able to ensure that 99% of providers have remained open right throughout the pandemic and been able to provide that essential care, especially for those essential service workers and those vulnerable children who we wanted to make sure were protected throughout the pandemic. Now, when it comes to our policy, what has it done for families? What it has done has seen a 3.2% reduction in out-of-pocket costs for parents, and it means around 1 million Australian families who are balancing work and parental responsibilities are benefiting from our package. 71.4% pay no more than $5 per hour in daycare centres, and within a subset 24% pay no more than $2 an hour. Our approach is targeted. It's about benefiting those who earn the least. It's about encouraging and incentivise people to get into work, and if they're not in work, to look at ways to train, to also to volunteer and to undertake activities which will help them get into work, and that's what our policy will do. Now, what we haven't done through our policy, is put in place a policy where if you earned $1 million and had 2 children in centre-based care for 30 hours a week, and you currently receive nothing, and you do not one extra minute of work, then you would receive $561.60 per week. You would receive $28,000 a year if you're earning $1 million for not doing one extra minute of work. Not one extra minute of work. Now, I'm not quite sure. We obviously haven't seen the costings of their policy, and we don't know whether that's eventually what they will go ahead with. It's a mystery. But we will continue to provide support for those who need it the most.
The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing and Assistant Treasurer. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is leading the housing market's recovery from the COVID-19 recession, including through its home builder grant and first home loan deposit scheme? Well done.
The Minister for Housing and Assistant Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Lindsay for her question, and I want to acknowledge the wonderful knowledge that she brings to this chamber, given that prior to being the member for Lindsay, she worked for Wentworth Community Housing, and she is so dedicated to the first-home buyers in her electorate, as well as those who are employed in the residential construction industry. And it was wonderful, therefore, to visit Mulgoa last week with the member for Lindsay, where we were able to announce that the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme, additional 10,000 places to first home buyers to get into the market with a guarantee from the federal government, was open, and we were able to be there with Nick from Rawson's Home, who explained that this was really fuelling jobs in the residential construction industry. When we announced the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme extension, the Managing Director of the HIA actually said this policy ticks all the boxes. It provides extra support for first home buyers and it supports the residential construction industry. The First Home Loan Deposit Scheme support on top of home builder is fuelling growth in our residential construction industry, and the home builder program has also been a huge success. Since home builder was announced, we've seen a 27% increase, according to the ABS, of loans for new dwellings. This is not just higher than pre-pandemic. This is the highest that it has ever been since the ABS has held records since 2002. A 27% increase. We've seen a 49.8% increase in new home sales. What does this mean? It means tradies' jobs on building sites, and that's what the home builder program has done, in addition, of course, to the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme. So it's no surprise, given that is what home builder has done, that the following has been said about the home builder program in supporting the residential construction industry. The CEO of the Master Builders Association said, "Home builder is the most effective government stimulus that they have seen in decades in the industry." And the CEO of the Property Council said, "Home builder has been the pop star of government stimulus policies released to date. Highly effective, immediate and great value for money. And importantly, Mr Speaker, it has helped protect hundreds of thousands of jobs and stimulated activity in the industry that needs it most." Very excitingly for us here on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, what is driving this growth? It's first home buyers. It's first home buyers. The CEO of CBA said yesterday the upswing in housing has so far been driven by first home buyers and owner-occupiers. The Morrison government stands with first home buyers and the residential construction.
And I call the member for Macarthur.
My question is to the Minister for the Environment. In June 2019, the Minister announced protecting native species was an immediate priority. Why is it then that almost 18 months later, 170 out of 171 outstanding threatened species recovery plans, including for the koala, are still overdue. Why does the government never deliver on its announcements?
The Minister for the Environment.
Well, can I thank the member for McCarthy for his question and thank him for his interest in threatened species, because it's an interest that the government shares and is committed to addressing. And I know members opposite raise the issue of recovery plans, and they're an important part of the conservation approach we take to threatened species generally, because 95% of all listed species have conservation advices. But I also want to make this point, Mr Speaker, is that what the Labor Party focuses on is a document, a name, a plan. What we focus on—
Members on my left. Members on my left. Minister might pause for a second. Members on my left. The Minister has the call.
What we focus on is a range of activities, including our safe havens, our work with feral invasive species, our $200 million
The Minister will just pause for a
bushfires.
second. I won't ask her to resume her seat because it's a fair way away. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, on relevance. The question went to the Minister's own announcement that there'd be 171 threatened species recovery plans as an immediate priority, and one has been delivered, one after 18 months.
The Minister has the call.
Threatened species recovery plans are part of the work of my department. They are on the way and they are ongoing. What I focus on is the outcomes when it comes to the conservation of species, when it comes to protecting their habitat against bushfires, against drought, against climate change, against the most awful thing, which is pests and weeds and invasive species. And if you look at our work post-bushfires, you will see how our expert panel, our Threatened Species Scientific Committee, our National Threatened Species Commissioner are all addressing this very important work.
The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is demonstrating international leadership by responding to the challenges posed by a changing climate to Australia and building resilience to natural disasters?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Herbert for his question and acknowledge his leadership, particularly after the floods in Townsville last year, in rebuilding that community. And over the last 2 years, this nation's faced flood, fire and drought. And in fact, Deloitte Economics estimates that the cost to our economy is around $18.2 billion, and that will escalate to around $39 billion by 2050. So our response, not only in the immediate relief and recovery, in committing $10 billion for drought, $3 billion for those floods in north-west Queensland, $2 billion for fires. It's not just about the here and now, but also about building that resilience within that envelope of money of new research, cutting-edge research that equips our emergency service personnel with world-class prediction modelling that helps them prepare even quicker. And even with the drought, we've just announced 8 new innovation hubs, drought innovation hubs, that will be out in the regions, out where the adoption of the research and development comes, so that our farmers are equipped with the tools to be able to grow even more and better food and fibre for the world. So it's important that we undertake that in a way that intersects also with our regional development corporations. They are the 15 commodities that actually, between the federal government and the producers, put in over $800 million a year in research money. And this is making sure that there is collaboration, coordination and no duplication of taxpayers' money and levy payers' money. This is getting better results for producers and equipping them. And we've put $88 million into now a new National Disaster Research Centre that will give the science to help our emergency services personnel prepare meticulously for disaster seasons well in advance. And that complements what the Minister for Energy has done around reducing our emissions, carbon capture storage technology. And in my electorate, we're going to see the coal-fired power station at Millmerran will reduce its emissions by up to 90%. That is backing ourselves with the smarts of the 21st century, the very best knowledge in the world to reduce our emissions, keep the electricity on and protecting our farmers. And tomorrow, the Prime Minister and I will be tabling our response to the Royal Commission into natural disasters after National Cabinet. It's important that we understand that this is a partnership with the states in working together in protecting Australians from natural disasters and making sure that the outcomes of these recommendations are worked collaboratively together to protect Australians well into the future for any natural disaster we may face.
The member for Jagga.
My question is to the Prime Minister. 48-year-old Nicole lost her job in March and is looking for a full-time position. She says that job ads which express a preference for younger workers eligible for the hiring credit are absolutely discriminatory. They may as well write, "If you're over this age, please don't even read the advert." What does the Prime Minister say to Nicole?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for her question. And whether it's in the member's electorate or anywhere else around this country, what Australians can take great heart from is that the time of our greatest need in generations, that the government, working together with the Reserve Bank, has invested more than $500 billion to ensure that Australia comes through the COVID-19 recession, Mr Speaker, frankly almost better than any other developed economy in the world today, Mr Speaker. This has been a response of unprecedented scale, of unprecedented expanse, Mr Speaker, to deal with the many challenges that exist in bringing Australia through the COVID-19 recession. Now, whether that was the immediate need for a lifeline of support through JobKeeper and JobSeeker and the measures that went to apprentices as well, to keep apprentices in work, or through, Mr Speaker, to the longer-term initiatives that have involved our advanced manufacturing sector, and everything in between, bringing forward investment decisions, bringing forward hiring decisions, and also delivering the tax relief that enables Australians to bring forward their decisions as well. That is an economic recovery plan, Mr Speaker, that is working in this country, and is reflected in the rebound in confidence that we have seen. A comeback in confidence that has been matched by a comeback in jobs, a comeback in investment, Mr Speaker, and a comeback in the ability of Australians all around this country to plan for their future with confidence. And as we come in to this Christmas period, and as we meet as a National Cabinet also tomorrow, and we continue the process of reopening this country safely and ensuring that it can remain safely open, the rest of the world looks at Australia and says, how have they done it? We would like to be able to achieve the same. And that was the message I had from President-elect Biden this morning when I spoke to him, Mr Speaker. And that is the message I get from leaders all around the world. Earlier this week, I had the discussion with the Prime Minister of Israel and the Prime Minister of Denmark and the Prime Minister of Norway, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister of Greece and the Prime Minister of Austria, and they have looked at Australia and they've seen what we've been able to achieve. Now, that does not lessen at all the significant blow that Australians have suffered during the course of this COVID-19 recession. But Australians have known and will always know that my government has their back, and this Leader of the Opposition is watching his.
The member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for International Development and the Pacific and the Assistant Defence Minister. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's strong regional leadership is ensuring a shared recovery from the pandemic in the South-West Pacific?
The Minister for International Development.
Thank you, Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Ford for his question, recognise his work with his very large Pacific community, including a large Samoan community. And I know Queensland's looking for some answers in Origin 3. He might be able to recruit a few from his large Pacific Islander community. Mr Speaker, there's never been a more important time for Australia to stand with our partners and our neighbours in our region. And with Australia, so many countries in the Indo-Pacific have done so well during the COVID-19 pandemic in managing the crisis. We congratulate them again. This matters. Their success is our success, and regional leadership matters, Mr Speaker. And so to the question, that's why from 2018 we stepped up in the Pacific. Australia stepped up and we showed up. The Prime Minister, the Government, the Foreign Minister and I have been regular visitors to the region, and we've stayed in touch with our counterparts throughout the region during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as I was pleased to hear from the Prime Minister, the importance of this is underscored by his announcement that he'll be visiting Papua New Guinea as one of his first priorities during the pandemic to make sure the depth of that relationship continues, and it's really appreciated at this time. Of critical importance, of course, in the budget was the development assistance package. We announced a record for an Australian government of $1.44 billion spent in the Pacific region, and most importantly, an additional $304.7 million of new money to help the Pacific, all the countries of the Pacific, deal with the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. This support has been very important to enabling, of course, workers in Australia here from the Pacific to be able to stay and keep working here through the Pacific, remitting money home. And of course, we've enabled more people under the restart of the Pacific Labour Scheme and the Seasonal Workers Program to come during the pandemic and keep working. Most importantly, Mr Speaker, the Morrison government's commitment to the vaccinating of the countries in Southeast Asia and the Pacific region is very important. That historic commitment of $523 million is deeply appreciated by every single country and the populations of our neighbours and our friends in the Indo-Pacific. But of course, we're regularly working, Mr Speaker, with our partners such as the US, Japan, New Zealand, France, Canada and India throughout the region, and our alliance with the US underpins that rules-based order. And that's why we're going to keep investing in the region, keep investing in the priorities of our partner countries in the region, and make sure they've got what they need to get through this very difficult time. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government makes no apology at all for prioritising the needs of the Indo-Pacific region first. It's our neighbours, it's our friends, it's our family. We owe it to them, and we're delivering at a record level support for them to get through this pandemic. Stepping up is vital for the shared future of this region, and under this government and this Prime Minister, we'll keep stepping up, we'll keep showing up, and we'll keep delivering for our family.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice.
Thank the Prime Minister. The Leader of the Opposition.